The reviews for A View from the Bridge were not kind. It didn't help that the play was slight, only one act. Success continued to elude Miller.
A View from the Bridge is less successful in terms of the number of weeks that it ran, even than The Crucible had been. And by 1955, there was a sense of crisis, I think, in Miller's life. He saw America going one way and him going another. I don't know that he knew where he was going to go next.
Ironically, at just the moment when many people found Arthur Miller's plays increasingly irrelevant, his private life began to attract attention. For years, Miller had been left cold by a marriage he'd outgrown. He had fought temptation, stayed faithful not so much to his wife, but to his sense of self. But by the time Miller was writing A View from the Bridge, he knew that his marriage was over, that another woman commanded his attention.
The night that A View from the Bridge opened, Marilyn Monroe is in the audience. And before curtain comes up, for some reason, Arthur came up to me. We were in the aisle near the back. And he says, Jim, the kids are all right. Everything's all right. That's all he said to me. It was only later that I realized that the vague rumors about Marilyn and Miller were true.
There was a side of Miller that I think was repressed for a long time, and Marilyn released that repression. The relationship between Arthur Miller and his wife, Mary, had really just become frigid. The icicles had formed, and Marilyn plainly melted them.
His marriage over, Miller went to Reno to establish residency for his divorce. For 6 weeks, he lived isolated in a cabin near Pyramid Lake. The only way to contact him was to write in care of Saul Bellow, also in Reno for a divorce, and by chance, Miller's neighbor. Marilyn had her own way of reaching Miller. She would call every day to a payphone located on a rarely traveled strip of highway. A nearby motel owner would occasionally answer, get into his pickup, and drive out to Miller's cabin. A week before Miller completed his residency requirement, word leaked to the press about his relationship with Marilyn. 12 days later, he was served with a HUAC subpoena and ordered to Washington.
I met him in California in 1951.
Where was that?
Well, I was on the set of a picture called Young as You Feel. I had a small part in it. And I hadn't seen it since.
When did you...
Why would they pick Miller in 1956? He'd had a series of plays which had become less and less successful. He was not the major figure he'd been in 1949. Time to pick him up was around the turn of 49, 50, 51, 52, even The Crucible 53. They didn't do it. There was no more information on his file than there had been earlier. The difference was his relationship with Marilyn Monroe.
The official reason for Miller's subpoena was a passport application he made in order to attend the London opening of A View from the Bridge. 5 days later, HUAC opened hearings into the fraudulent procurement and misuse of American passports by persons in the service of the Communist conspiracy. Under this pretext, the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed Arthur Miller. Miller had been under the government's watch for nearly a decade. In fact, his FBI file dated back to 1947, when he was named, along with Kazan, by Jack Warner. Even though Miller and Kazan were named at the same time, they did not share similar fates. Miller was called before HUAC 4 years after Kazan, and in that short time, the political climate had changed considerably.
The difference between Kazan testifying in 52 and Miller in 56 is also a difference in American culture during the Cold War. By 1956, Joseph Stalin is dead. Joseph McCarthy has been neutered, condemned by the Senate in 1954. The atmosphere of 56 is more open. It's not as oppressive. Dalton Trumbo has gotten an Oscar under the name of Robert Rich, and everybody hip knows that Dalton Trumbo, one of the original Hollywood 10, has written this screenplay and gotten an Oscar for it. So 56 is a very different year than 52. The atmosphere is certainly not as oppressive and fraught with tension as it was just 4 years earlier.
But if Arthur Miller was under much less political and social pressure than Elia Kazan had been, Marilyn Monroe was not.
Hollywood had a hot property in Marilyn Monroe. Suddenly, she's going to get married to this man who's hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They want to protect their product. So Spiros Skouras, head of 20th Century Fox, goes to see them in New York on the eve of the hearings to persuade Arthur Miller to name names and thus protect his investment, 20th Century Fox's investment, in Marilyn Monroe.
In New York, Skouras tried to talk some sense into Miller, and when that failed, into Monroe. But Marilyn, in the face of studio pressure, held her ground. She told Skouras she hoped Miller would defy the committee. But her support of Miller didn't stop there. Miller's last two plays had not done well. He now had child support and alimony to worry about. If he was cited for contempt of Congress, he would have to appeal and could be driven into debt. With the exception of money put aside for her mother, Marilyn drew up a new will and left everything to Miller. She also refused her lawyer's advice to get a prenuptial agreement and asked him to look into optioning Miller's plays. There were, however, limits to Marilyn's aid.
Chairman Walters basically said to Miller, if you can convince Marilyn Monroe to be photographed with me, I'd be very grateful, and you would not have to testify before the committee. He wanted to have his picture taken with Marilyn Monroe for political advantage, because he knew if he could have that picture circulated when he was running for re-election, that it would look as though she had endorsed his candidacy, and that would be something that would win the hearts of the public that would be voting in that election.
Miller and Marilyn refused the request, and on June 21, 1956, Miller appeared under oath before the House Un-American Activities Committee. In a dark hearing room, the chief prosecutor read from a stack of petitions Miller had signed over the past 20 years. Pleas to free political prisoners, appeals for friendship with the Soviet Union. With each one, Miller was asked, "Did you sign this?" With each one, the playwright answered, "Yes." But when he was asked to name names, Miller refused, saying, "I want you to understand that I am not protecting the Communists or the Communist Party. I am trying to, and I will, protect my sense of myself."
The moment in the committee hearings when he declares that he is not going to offer up other people's names is almost a paraphrase of the speech made by John Proctor. And in fact, I asked him about that once, and he said, what else is there to say? What Proctor says, what he says, is, in his view, the only thing you could say with any integrity. And this is what puzzles him about Kazan. How could you live with yourself after you had done this? It's not just the view of other people that matters, it's your view of yourself.
But however virtuous Miller seemed, he was not above playing the same public relations game as the committee. He too knew the power of Marilyn Monroe, knew that he could use her popularity to aid his case. It's why he decided to announce their engagement during his testimony.
Mr. Miller, why did you file application for passport?
I wanted to go to England.
For what reason?
You guess.
We'd like you to
I wanted to be with the woman who is going to be my wife.
You mean Marilyn Monroe?
That's correct.
When are you going to be married?
I don't know right now. I haven't had a minute to think, but it'll be shortly.
Where?
New York or Connecticut, I don't know.
New York or Connecticut. You say shortly, you think within the month?
Yes.
The interesting thing to me about the hearings is that Marilyn Monroe probably got him into them, and Marilyn Monroe probably got him out of them. Because when he suddenly announces that he intends to marry Marilyn Monroe, it sounds awfully like news management, as if he's designing tomorrow's headlines, which are not going to be about his grilling, but about the marriage of the sex icon of America.
It didn't work out that way. The next day's headlines were Spiros Skouras and 20th Century Fox's worst nightmare. Miller helped front groups, read the New York Times. Backed red causes, blared the Journal American. The Chicago Tribune's headline was the worst. Miller had come off as pompous, self-important. Marilyn went to work. She was no fool. She knew what the press wanted, and she knew how to manage them. Determined to change the public perception of her fiancé, she called a press conference that afternoon on the sidewalk of her Sutton Place apartment.
Mr. Miller, Miss Monroe, yesterday you didn't know when you were going to get married. Do you know today?
It'll be in July before the 13th.
No definite date has been set.
I haven't got one yet.
Where are you going to be married, Evan?
I wish I could tell you at this moment. I'm arranging.
Suppose Mr. Miller doesn't get a passport. Are you prepared to change your plans in any way?
There's no change.
No change of plans.
Mr. Miller.
What do you think of this whole ruckus, Mr. Miller?
It's good you only get married once.
With Marilyn's help, Miller became the image of a man in love, not a red sympathizer who had defied a congressional committee. By the weekend, the nation's papers were no longer writing about charges of contempt or commie sympathies, but of wedding plans. On June 29, 1956, Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe got married before a judge at the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains, New York. The following Sunday, they were married again, this time before family and friends in a traditional Jewish ceremony.
For the television and newsreels, we have a farewell sang. Come on! Whoa!
On July 10, 1956, HUAC voted to recommend to the full House that Arthur Miller be cited for contempt of Congress. The House, by a vote of 373 to 9, did just that. In February, a grand jury indicted Miller. That May, he was found guilty, fined $500 and given a suspended 1-month jail sentence. Miller appealed.
Just staying in the house here?
That's right.
Has the trial upset your personal life to any degree, Miss Monroe?
I would like to say that I'm fully confident that in the end my husband will win this case.
In 1958, 3 years after A View from the Bridge premiered on Broadway, Miller's case was reversed by the U.S. Court of Appeals on a technicality. Spiros Skouras wrote Miller his congratulations. This man, who 7 years earlier had urged Kazan to name names, and 4 years later pressed Miller to do the same, now insisted he was thrilled with the court's decision.